She was just a maid, scrubbing floors in a mansion owned by New York's most feared crime boss. She had nothing, no money, no home, no hope. Her baby daughter was the only reason she kept breathing. But when that baby was brought into his house by accident, something unthinkable happened. The child stopped crying the moment she saw him. She reached out her tiny arms and clung to the most dangerous man in the city. And he, the man who made grown men beg for mercy, stood completely still, holding her as if she were made of glass. No one in that hallway could believe what they were seeing. What happened in the months that followed would shatter an empire, ignite a war, and reveal a secret that changed everything. This is a story about a mother's unbreakable courage, a monster's hidden heart, and a baby who saw the truth that everyone else was too afraid to see. If you have ever been judged, underestimated, or counted out, this story is for you. If this already has your attention, hit like right now. Share this with someone who loves a powerful story, and subscribe so you never miss another episode. Now let us begin. A baby's cry sliced through the marble hall, sharp as an alarm. "Please stop, my love," Maddie begged in a desperate whisper. She bounced her 11-month-old daughter, Isla, but the wailing only intensified. Isla's face was a red knot of pure rage. Other staff members cast worried glances before quickly looking away. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Morrison, moved closer. "You must silence that child," she hissed, her eyes darting to the double doors down the corridor. "He will hear you." Maddie's heart hammered against her ribs. For 3 weeks, she had scrubbed floors in this dangerous house, learning to be invisible. For 3 weeks, she had pretended not to know the name Nikolai Volkov. "The nanny is sick," Maddie explained, her voice trembling. "I had no one else." "You thought wrong," Mrs. Morrison snapped. "Do you have any idea who he is?" At that moment, the doors burst open. Nikolai Volkov stood there, a storm confined to a black suit. He was 6 feet and 2 inches of controlled violence. His cold gray eyes swept across the terrified staff. A muscle twitched in his clenched jaw. "Who," he asked, his voice a horrifying whisper, "is making that noise?" Maddie's blood ran cold, while Isla continued to scream, oblivious to the monster before them. "I asked a question," Nikolai repeated. He moved 1 step forward, and the air in the hall turned to ice. "My child, sir," Maddie managed to say. "My daughter, I am so sorry." His command was sharp and simple. "Bring her here." Maddie's legs threatened to give out. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet obeyed. She carried her wailing child toward New York's most feared man as the other staff scattered like insects. She stopped in front of him, clutching Isla tightly. She could see the faint scar on his cheek and the absolute cold in his eyes. "I will leave now," she stammered. He ignored her. "How many months?" Maddie froze. "What?" "The child?" he clarified. "How many months old is she?" 11 months, sir." Nikolai lowered his gaze to the screaming baby. His expression was a mask of stone. Then he did the unthinkable. He held out his hand. "Don't," Maddie blurted out, instinctively pulling back. "I'm sorry, sir, but she hates strangers. She will only scream louder." His hand remained in the air, patient. As Maddie began to plead again, Isla fell silent. The baby turned in her mother's arms and reached for Nikolai, for the man who was a living nightmare. "No, baby, no, no," Maddie cried. Isla struggled against her, desperate to get to the stranger. "Let her go," Nikolai said softly. "Sir, I really don't think—" "Let her." Against every screaming instinct, Maddie's arms loosened. Isla threw herself into Nikolai Volkov's arms. A suffocating silence filled the hallway. The most feared man in the city stood perfectly still with a baby clinging to his suit. Her small head rested on his shoulder, her body limp with total trust. For just a moment, a look of pure shock broke through Nikolai's cold expression. Then the mask slammed back into place. She is calm now, he observed in a neutral tone. Maddie was speechless, her mind unable to process the scene. Yes, sir, she stammered. I do not understand it. What is her name? Isla. With surprising care, Nikolai adjusted the baby, supporting her more firmly. Ela made a soft, happy sound and closed her eyes, falling asleep in his arms. Mrs. Morrison's trembling voice broke the strange quiet. Sir, your meeting. The partners from Russia are waiting for you. Nikolai's eyes remained on the sleeping child. Reschedule, he said, his voice firm. But sir, they flew from Moscow. I said, reschedule. His tone was low, but cut like a razor. Mrs. Morrison hurried away without another word. Maddie stood in shock. He had just canceled a major meeting because her daughter was asleep on his shoulder. It made no sense. Come with me, Nikolai said, turning toward his office. Maddie hesitated. I can take her. You will only wake her, he replied without stopping. Come. It was an order, not an invitation. Maddie swallowed hard and followed. She had no choice. His office was enormous, with a floor-to-ceiling view of Manhattan. A giant mahogany desk stood in the center, but Maddie's attention was caught by a glass display cabinet. Inside, at least 12 handguns were lined up like a deadly collection. She forced her eyes away. Sit, Nikolai ordered, nodding toward a chair. He moved with incredible gentleness, lowering himself into his own seat without disturbing Isla, who slept on against his chest. The image was surreal. A brutal mafia boss in an expensive suit holding a sleeping infant. Explain to me, Nikolai said, his voice returning to its terrifying chill, why you brought a child into my home. Maddie took a shaky breath. My nanny had an emergency at 5 a.m, sir. I had no one else to watch her. She looked directly into his cold eyes. I am 3 months behind on rent. In 10 days, we will be evicted. If I miss 1 day of work, I will be fired. I had to choose between this risk and my daughter sleeping on the street. She finished, breathing hard. Nikolai just watched her, his unblinking stare seeming to read her soul. The silence was heavy and crushing. The rent, he finally said. How much is it? Maddie was confused. $4,500, sir. Nikolai tilted his head slightly, as if the number was too small to comprehend. And for him, it probably was. How long have you worked for me? He asked. 3 weeks, sir. And before that? Maddie hesitated. Before that, She had been a student. He asked where. Maddie refused to speak the name of the school, of the life she lost. But Nikolai's gaze demanded the truth. Her voice was a faint sound. Yale. I was in law school. For a moment, his expression changed. Just an eyebrow, slightly raised. Surprise. He repeated the word. Yale. Law? She nodded. Yes, sir. His next words were not a question. And now you scrub my floors. The statement landed like a blow. She looked down, unable to face him. Yes, sir. Silence filled the room. Isla, the baby in his arms, made a soft noise and fell deeper into sleep. His hand moved to hold her more securely, his eyes never leaving Maddie. His stare remained on her. Yale, Nikolai said again, his voice dangerously calm. Law, you must have had a full scholarship. You don't come from money. Maddie's throat felt tight as she nodded. Yes, sir. One of only 20. He asked a simple question of 3 words. And then what? The question forced open a painful memory she had locked away for 2 years. She took a sharp breath, her nails pressing into her skin. I met a man, she started, her voice growing quiet. Jason Whitmore. His family was one of the richest in the state. His father was a powerful lawyer. His mother ran major charities. He was everything a girl could want. He knew exactly what to say to a naive 23-year-old, she said, with a bitter smile. I believed it was love. For him, it was a game. Nikolai remained silent, watching her. His stillness was worse than any rage. I became pregnant during my second year, Maddie continued, her voice trembling. I thought he would be pleased. We had been together for 8 months. He spoke of our future. She paused, swallowing hard. But his face changed when he saw the test. His warm eyes turned to ice. He told me to get rid of it, that his family would never approve. He offered cash for me to fix the problem and leave his life for good. Her voice grew hard. He called my daughter a problem. Nikolai said nothing, but his jaw muscle twitched. I told him no, Maddie said, her chin rising. I said I would have my baby, with or without him. He laughed at me. He told me good luck and that his family's lawyers would crush me. She remembered the sound of his apartment door closing. She stood alone in the hall, a hand on her stomach. 2 weeks after that, Yale canceled her scholarship. The school claimed she broke a rule, but she knew the Whitmores had used their influence to remove her. She laughed, a sound without humor, so I vanished. My dream of being a lawyer, gone. I came to New York to be invisible, to survive. She looked at him. And now I clean your home. Nikolai watched her, his expression impossible to understand. His full name, he said. Maddie went still. Jason Whitmore? I need everything. His address, his father's firm. His voice was level, but his eyes held a dangerous light. She knew what he was planning. No, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. No, sir. She took a breath. My daughter needs her mother. She does not need a mother who helped kill her father. Maddie met his gaze directly. You could find him without my help. But I will not be the one who gives you his name. I will never forgive him, but my child will not have a killer for a mother. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Nikolai smiled. It was not a kind expression, just a slight curve of his lips. But his eyes showed a flicker of respect. You have courage, he said quietly. That is interesting. Maddie sat frozen, waiting for him to fire her. She braced herself to be thrown out, to start over from nothing once more. She knew how to do that. But he did not tell her to leave. Instead, he pushed a button on his desk. Connor, come in. The door opened almost instantly. A tall man entered, moving with a silent deadliness. Maddie knew him as Nikolai's chief bodyguard. The terrified housekeeper, Mrs. Morrison, followed him in. Connor looked from Maddie to the baby in Nikolai's arms, a brief hint of confusion on his face. This is Maddie Harper, Nikolai announced, his tone flat. Age 27, a former law student from Yale. She has been on the cleaning staff for 3 weeks. He looked down at Ela, who slept on. The baby's small hand clutched his suit. Effective immediately, she is no longer a cleaner here. Maddie's stomach dropped. This was it. She is now my personal assistant. Absolute quiet descended on the room. Maddie could not believe what she heard. Connor, a man who had likely seen everything, stared with his mouth hanging open. Mrs. Morrison leaned against the wall, looking faint. Boss, Connor started, his voice strained. She has the mind of a Yale lawyer, Nikolai interrupted. She is intelligent. She notices things, and she has courage. She has a backbone. He looked right at Maddie. And she is not afraid to tell me no. How many people do we know who would do that, Connor? The question needed no answer. Sir, I cannot, Maddie finally managed to say. You can, Nikolai stated, cutting her off. Your new salary is $15,000 a month. Maddie gasped. That was more money than she could imagine. It was a new life for her and Isla. The apartment over the garage is yours, he went on. Move in tomorrow. We will provide childcare. Your daughter will be safe here. Maddie was overwhelmed. I do not understand, she said. Why are you doing this? You owe me nothing. I am just a cleaner. Nikolai looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms. For just a second, a look of deep sadness crossed his face. Maddie barely saw it before it was gone. It was a look of loss. This is a payment, he said in a low voice. For what? She asked. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and she saw a flicker of the man behind the monster. For what your daughter reminded me of, Nikolai said carefully. She reminded me that it is possible to be seen for something other than what I am. A monster. The room went dead silent. Connor was frozen, his eyes huge. Mrs. Morrison sagged against the wall, and Maddie just sat there, looking at the man holding her child. He was the man all of New York feared, the one they called the Wolf. She suddenly knew that Issa saw something different. Maddie swallowed. I do not know what to say. Do not say anything, Nikolai said. Just accept. He carefully passed Issa into Maddie's arms. The baby stirred but stayed asleep. Connor will handle the details. You start tomorrow at 8. Nikolai turned his back and walked to the window. Maddie looked up. Do not make me regret this. That night, sleep never came. She was in a massive bed with silk sheets, in an apartment far larger than any place she had ever called home. High ceilings arched overhead, and oak floors gleamed. The kitchen had perfect white marble, and a glass wall overlooked the Hudson River. Manhattan's lights sparkled like fallen stars. Maddie lay awake in the dark, wondering if it was all a dream. Just 12 hours ago, she was scrubbing a bathroom floor, desperate for $4,500. Now she was in $1 million apartment. Her new job paid $15,000 a month. A mafia boss had hired a former FBI agent to babysit her daughter. This could not be real. She turned and looked at the crib beside her bed. It was brand new. Connor told her it was from a store where billionaires shopped for their kids. The price was more than she used to make in a year. Issa slept inside, her tiny hands on her chest, breathing peacefully. She was an angel who had convinced a monster to change their lives overnight. Maddie could not understand it. Why had Issa reached for Nikolai? Her daughter trusted no one but her. Yet she had instantly trusted that stranger. And why had the cold, ruthless Nikolai responded that way? Maddie remembered the look in his eyes as he held Issa. She saw his tough expression break for just a second. He had said that not everyone saw a monster when they looked at him. There was a story behind those words, a deep pain that had never healed. Her new phone vibrated, pulling her from her thoughts. It was another gift from Connor. A message from an unknown number appeared. Maddie's heart pounded as she opened it. The baby. Is she sleeping well? She stared at the words. The most feared man in New York was texting her about her daughter near midnight. She felt a mix of fear, gratitude, and confusion. Her hands shook as she typed her answer. Yes, sir. She has been asleep for 3 hours. A new record. She sent the message and waited. The reply came a moment later. Good. Just that one word. Maddie stared at the blank screen, a strange warmth spreading in her chest. It was not fear. It was something she could not name. She tried to dismiss it. He is a killer. He is dangerous. But as she fell asleep, the last thing she saw was not the beautiful apartment. It was Nikolai Volkov's unforgettable expression as he looked at her child. Morning arrived too quickly. Sunlight streamed through the glass wall, waking her. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then it all came back. The job, the apartment, the mafia boss. It was real. She showered and put on her only black dress. a thrift store find from her college days. It was old and worn, but it was all she had that looked professional. She tried to make herself look like she belonged, but failed. A knock came at exactly 8 in the morning. It was Connor Hayes. His face was cold, but his eyes seemed softer than before. "Ready?" he asked. Maddie nodded, holding Issa. As they walked, Connor explained her new job. Nikolai's entire schedule was on her new tablet. All his work calls would come through her phone. She would manage his meetings, screen his calls, and take notes on everything. "You will know things that most people here are not allowed to know," Connor said gravely. "That makes you a target." "Do you understand?" Maddie swallowed. "I understand." Connor stopped. "Are you scared?" Maddie paused, then nodded, yes. A small smile touched his lips. "Good." "Everyone is." They reached a door, and Connor knocked. A woman of about 52 opened it. Her hair was short and neat, her eyes sharp but warm. Her posture was perfect and controlled, like someone trained to kill. But her smile for Issa was incredibly soft. "This is Miss Walsh," Connor said. "She is a former FBI agent, 20 years in witness protection. She specializes in protecting children." Miss Walsh stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Issa. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently. "I hear you are a tough one." Maddie wanted to warn her that Issa screamed when strangers touched her. But before she could speak, Miss Walsh held out her arms. And Issa, the baby who cried if anyone but her mother held her, simply leaned forward into the woman's embrace. Maddie watched in shock as her daughter settled comfortably in Miss Walsh's arms. Issa did not cry. She giggled when Miss Walsh tapped her nose. "How did you do that?" Maddie asked. "She never does that." Miss Walsh's smile was warm. "Children feel energy," she explained. "They know who is safe. Adults judge by reputation and what they hear. Children use instinct." She looked from Issa back to Maddie. "This little one knows she is safe here." Maddie thought about Nikolai. She remembered how Issa had thrown herself into his arms and fallen asleep in less than a minute. If Miss Walsh was right, what energy did Issa feel from Nikolai Volkov that no one else could? After leaving Issa, Connor led Maddie toward Nikolai's office. Her heart hammered with each step. The last time she was in this room, she was a cleaner about to be fired. Now, she was the personal assistant to a powerful crime boss. She was not sure which was worse. Connor knocked twice on the large doors and opened them. He guided Maddie inside and then left, closing the doors behind him. Nikolai stood by the window with a phone to his ear, speaking Russian in a low, cold voice. Maddie understood nothing, but she knew the person on the line was in trouble. His tone was like ice. Each word was a precise, merciless shot. Maddie stood silently by the door, afraid to even breathe. She just waited. Nikolai ended the call with a low threat. He pocketed the phone and turned, his gray eyes locked with Maddie's blue ones. She fought the urge to look away. Her voice shook slightly. "Sir, I am ready." He tilted his head, watching her. "You are tense," he said. "I am, sir," she agreed. There was no use denying it. "Good. Tension keeps you sharp." Nikolai walked to his desk, each movement showing his power. "But there is a problem." Maddie blinked. "What problem, sir?" "That is the problem." He stopped and faced her. "Stop calling me sir. We will work together every day. If you say sir constantly, I will lose my mind." Maddie was speechless. "What should I call you?" "Nikolai." His answer was simple. "When we are alone, you call me Nikolai. You can be formal in front of other people. But in this room, it is just Nikolai." Maddie swallowed. The name felt dangerous. The space between them was shrinking, and she was not sure if it was a good thing. "Say it," he commanded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Say my name." Maddie took a deep breath. "Nikolai." The word felt strange, coming from her mouth. She saw something shift in his eyes, a brief flash that disappeared. Better, he said, his voice a little deeper. He sat in his leather chair and pointed to the one opposite him. Today you will only observe, Nikolai began, his tone once again cold and all business. I have 4 meetings. You will sit with me. You will watch and hear everything. Pay attention to every single detail. Their words, their looks, their movements. After each meeting, you will report what you noticed. Maddie nodded, memorizing every word. I understand. You are allowed to ask questions, Nikolai went on. Any at all. If you are confused, ask. If you are curious, ask. I do not want an assistant who just follows orders. I want one who thinks. He looked directly at her. Your daughter saw something in me that no one else did. I am curious if you have the same instinct. The first meeting was at 9 in the morning. A middle-aged man in a gray suit came in. He was the chief executive officer of a huge tech company. Maddie knew his name from Forbes magazine, but the confident man in the picture was not here today. This man was sweating. His hand trembled as he picked up his water. He could not look Nikolai in the eye for more than 2 seconds. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Nikolai never raised his voice. He did not have to. His calm, quiet tone and cold gray eyes were enough to make the powerful chief executive agree to every single condition. When the man left, Maddie saw that the back of his shirt was soaked with sweat. The second meeting was much more tense. 2 Russian men entered. They were large, with wide shoulders and tattoos showing beneath their shirt cuffs. They spoke in Russian. Maddie could only guess what they said from their tone. This was not a negotiation. It was a standoff. Nikolai and the men exchanged short, sharp sentences. The air grew thick. Maddie felt like she could not breathe. After almost an hour, one Russian nodded once. Both men stood and left. They did not shake hands. They did not say farewell. They just left. Maddie let out a shaky breath as the door closed. The third meeting changed the mood completely. When the door opened, Maddie felt the air shift. Nikolai, who had been calm before, suddenly went still. His shoulders tightened, his jaw clenched, his gray eyes became colder than ice. The man who came in was in his 60s, with white hair and eyes as sharp as razors. He wore a cream suit and gold rings. He moved like a man who knew he was just as dangerous as Nikolai. 2 huge bodyguards followed him, Salvatore Caruso. Maddie did not know the name, but she knew what he represented. He was Mafia, the kind who worked against Nikolai, not with him. Caruso sat down, smiling a smile that held no warmth. They spoke English, but every word had a hidden meaning. It was like 2 predators testing each other for weakness. Then, Caruso's eyes moved to Maddie. She felt his stare like a cold knife on her skin. He looked her up and down slowly, as if she were an item for sale. A new assistant? Caruso asked, his voice like oil. He smiled a freezing smile. Beautiful. Very beautiful. He paused, thinking, I hope she is more durable than the last one. Maddie did not know what he meant, but she saw Nikolai's reaction. He went completely rigid for a single moment. It was enough for her to understand. Something awful had happened to the previous assistant, and Caruso was involved. Nikolai did not reply. He just stared at Caruso with a murderous look. When he finally spoke, his voice was so cold the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. This meeting is over. Caruso laughed as he got up. Of course. I just came to say hello. He walked to the door, but stopped by Maddie's chair. He leaned down so close she could smell his expensive cigars. He whispered, just for her to hear. Be careful, little girl. This world is a dangerous place for those who stand too close to the wolf. Then he left with his bodyguards. When the door closed, Maddie realized she was shaking. The fourth meeting was a blur. A lawyer came with a pile of papers and figures related to laundered money. She tried to pay attention, but her mind was stuck on what just happened. The previous assistant, more durable. Caruso knew something, and Nikolai's brief stiffness confirmed it was a terrible story. After the lawyer left, Maddie sat frozen in her chair. She waited for Nikolai to say something. He stood by the window, with his back to her, looking out at the city. For the first time, Maddie felt truly terrified. The silence felt endless. Then Nikolai turned. His gray eyes pierced through her. "You observed," he said. It was not a question. "Now, tell me what you saw." Maddie took a deep breath, forcing her thoughts into order. "The first meeting," she started, her voice a little unsteady. "That chief executive was clearly afraid of you, but he gave in too easily. He did not argue or ask for time. He just agreed to everything." She paused, watching Nikolai, but his expression was blank. "That means he will look for a way out. In a few months, he will try to break the deal or change the terms from within." Nikolai gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. "Continue." Maddie felt a small spark of confidence. "The second meeting with the two Russians. I did not understand their words, but I saw their actions. They were not afraid of you. They respected your power. That meeting was about defining territory, not making a deal. Both sides stood their ground. They agreed to a truce because conflict was too expensive. But this was just a pause, not peace." Nikolai remained silent, but Maddie saw something shift in his gaze. The coldness was gone. It was replaced by curiosity, maybe even respect. "At the third meeting," Maddie said, her voice dropping as she mentioned Caruso, "he is different. He has no fear of you and none of the respect the Russians showed. He was there to provoke you, to test your limits." Maddie remembered Caruso's nervous habit. He constantly twisted the ring on his hand. He did it every time he said something important. It was a sign of stress. "He's hiding something big." Maddie looked directly at Nikolai. "This man is dangerous, and he is coming for you." A long moment passed. Then Nikolai did the last thing she expected. He smiled. It was not his usual cold expression. It was a genuine smile, even if it vanished quickly. "You are better than I expected," he told her. "What about the fourth man?" Maddie shrugged. "A lawyer handling the dirty money. I understood his methods, but he is only a tool, not the one in charge. Nothing important there." Nikolai nodded and stood up. "That is all for today. Go back to Isla." Maddie was surprised. "It is only 2 o'clock, Nikolai." She stopped herself. "You have done enough," he said. "Go rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Maddie rose, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. As she reached the door, Nikolai called her name. "Maddie?" She turned. He stood by the window, a dark figure against the afternoon light. "Caruso is a threat," he said softly. "You were right about that. But now you are a target on his list." Maddie's chest grew tight. "I understand." Nikolai's tone was serious. "No, I do not think you do, but you will. Connor will provide the details." She nodded and left the room. Connor was waiting outside, his expression grim. He said nothing, simply motioning for her to walk with him. They went down a long hall in silence. When they reached an empty corner, he stopped and faced her. "Caruso has noticed you," he said directly. "I cannot say why. Maybe your looks. Maybe because you are new, or maybe he wants to anger the boss. The reason does not matter. You are in his sights, and that is a very bad place to be." Maddie felt a lump in her throat. "What do I do?" "Never be alone," Connor commanded. "Do not leave the property without a guard. Do not answer calls from numbers you do not know. Do not open your door to strangers. If you see anything out of the ordinary, you call me right away." He stared at her, his eyes intense. "Understood?" She nodded, a chill running through her. "I understand." Connor watched her for a moment, as if judging her sincerity. "Good. Now go to your daughter, and do not forget what I said." Maddie walked away, her heart pounding. She thought of Isla and the safety of their apartment. She pictured Nikolai's face when he spoke of Caruso, and she heard Connor's warning in her mind. This world was deadly, especially for those who got too close to men like Nikolai. But Maddie had no other choice. She had to move even closer. The next few weeks felt like a strange dream. She learned about Nikolai Vulov's empire, a world built on fear, but run with perfect efficiency. She attended meetings with powerful men, taking notes on everything she saw and heard for Nikolai. She learned to read a person's hidden intentions, to spot a lie, to hear the words that were never spoken. She was learning to navigate the darkness without being consumed by it. And she was learning about the real Nikolai, the man behind the fearsome reputation. Every single evening, he came to her apartment to see Isla. He never called ahead. He would just appear, knock softly, and step inside as if he belonged there. Isla always knew him. She would smile and reach for him. And Nikolai, the man who terrified New York, would lift the baby with incredible gentleness. Maddie watched them, feeling an emotion she tried to ignore. The same hands that had committed terrible acts now held her daughter with a tenderness she had never seen before. Nikolai would speak to Isla in a low, warm voice. He would ask about her day, and she would answer with happy baby sounds. He rocked her and sang Russian lullabies. Sometimes Maddie saw him close his eyes while holding Isla, as if trying to burn the moment into his memory. Maddie felt her own heart changing. She told herself it was not love. It was just gratitude. It was a mother's joy at seeing her child loved, but she knew she was lying to herself. But life was not just these quiet moments. The security around her tightened. Before, she would only sometimes notice a guard nearby. Now, at least 2 men followed her constantly. Silent and watchful, Connor appeared more often, escorting her any time she left the apartment. He rarely spoke, he just walked beside her like a human shield. Maddie understood why. The reason was Caruso. One night, about 2 weeks later, Maddie woke up with a terrible feeling. She went to the window and looked down at the street. Her breath caught. A black vehicle was parked just outside the main gate. The lights were off. She could see the faint shapes of people inside. They were looking up at her apartment. Maddie quickly moved away from the window, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone to call Connor. When she looked back, the vehicle was gone. It had vanished completely. Maddie stood in the dark room, phone in her hand, knowing the threat was real. Someone was watching her. One evening, 3 weeks after she saw the vehicle, everything changed. Nikolai arrived at his usual time. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and his shoulders were slumped with a heavy burden. But his expression softened the moment he saw Ila's happy face. That heavy feeling on Maddie's shoulders finally lifted. Nikolai sat on the floor as he did each night, opening his arms to Isla. The baby held the sofa, her tiny legs shaking with effort. Then something incredible happened. Isla let go. She stood on her own, wobbled, and took a step forward. 1, 2, 3 unsteady steps, the first of her life. Every one was aimed directly at Nikolai. Maddie covered her mouth as tears began to fall. "She's walking," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Nikolai, look." He did not speak. He just stared at Isla, his own eyes shining. After a few more steps, Isla stumbled. But Nikolai caught her. He pulled her into a tight hug against his chest. Isla's laugh filled the room. "Good girl," Nikolai said, his voice low and unsteady, so strong now. He looked at Maddie, and his mask was gone. He was just a man holding a child with incredible tenderness. Maddie wanted to thank him, to tell him what this meant, but words failed her. They sat in a comfortable silence. Nikolai rocked Isla, while Maddie watched from the sofa. But then she remembered the black car and the sleepless nights. She knew it was better to stay quiet, but she could not. Nikolai, she said, her voice small. The black SUV outside a few nights ago. Who was in it? He did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes on Ela, but Maddie saw his jaw clench. The silence stretched. She thought he would ignore. Here, finally, he spoke, his voice heavy. Caruso's people. He is testing me. Maddie's heart tightened. She had guessed as much, but his confirmation was a cold shock. Testing what? My weakness. Nikolai raised his head, his gray eyes meeting hers. He thinks you are my weakness. Maddie was stunned. Me? Why? I just work for you. Do you really think Caruso believes that? Nikolai's voice was bitter. He saw how I looked at you. He saw my reaction when he spoke your name. He is a predator who knows how to find a weak point. A heavy silence fell over them. Maddie did not know what to say. She wanted to ask why he cared enough for her to become his weakness, but she was too afraid. Nikolai looked down at Isla, his expression shifting. The mask disappeared, revealing something raw and old. I had a sister, he said, his voice a near whisper. Her name was Anya. She was small, like Ela. She loved to be held. Maddie held her breath. This was the first time he had ever shared anything personal. She stayed perfectly still, scared that any movement would make him stop. Anya, Maddie repeated softly. What happened? He paused, his eyes fixed on Isla. Maddie saw a pain in them, so deep, it felt like an ocean. She died, he said, and it was my fault. Silence consumed the room. Maddie wanted to offer comfort, but knew the words would sound empty. So she waited. I was 16 that year, he began, his voice distant. His gaze remained on Isla, who was falling asleep in his arms. Anya was 7. She was the light of our family in a very dark world. Nikolai paused, his jaw tight. My father ran the organization before me. He built this empire and made many enemies. I knew this. I grew up with it. But I believed my family was untouchable. He let out a short, empty laugh. I was wrong. Maddie sat frozen, afraid to break the moment. Nikolai was letting her see a part of him that no one else had. That night, he continued, his voice even lower, I was supposed to be home. My father ordered me to watch Anya while he was at a meeting. But I was 16 and stupid. I thought I was untouchable. I snuck out to see my friends. He stopped, and his arm tightened around Isla, as if she might disappear. When I returned, the house was on fire. The door was destroyed. There were guards everywhere, and Anya. His voice cracked. She was in her room, holding the teddy bear I had given her. She looked like she was asleep, but she was not breathing. Tears ran down Maddie's cheeks. She looked at the man the world called a monster and saw a boy still wounded after 20 years. I promised her, Nikolai whispered. Before I left, Anya told me she was scared of strange noises. I told her not to worry. I told her I would always protect her. I promised her. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting Maddie's. I promised, and I broke that promise. Maddie reached out and put her hand on his. His skin was cold, but he did not pull away. That was not your fault, she said, her voice certain. You were a child. You could not have known. I should have been there, he answered, his voice hard. My job was to protect her. No, Nikolai. That was not the job of a 16-year-old boy. That was for the adults who should have protected you both. She held his hand tighter. You did not kill Anya. The men who attacked your home are the killers. You were just a boy who lost everything. He looked at her, and his walls finally came down. He was not a boss, just a man full of pain. For 20 years, I took my revenge, Nikolai said. I found every person involved. I made them pay. But no amount of blood brings Anya back. He looked from Isla to Maddie. When your daughter came into my arms, I saw my sister in her eyes. I saw the same trust. I knew I could not fail again. He placed his other hand over Maddie's. I will not break another promise. Not for Isla, and not for you. Their eyes met, and the air changed. They were no longer just an employer and an assistant. They were two broken people who had found something unexpected in each other. Maddie felt the warmth of his hand. She felt the pulse beneath her fingers. She wanted to admit what she was feeling, but she could not. Not yet. Looking at him, she knew he felt the same. They both knew it was there, but neither was ready to say it. So they just sat together, holding hands in the moonlight, while a baby slept between them. The world shifted on Tuesday morning. Maddie felt it as soon as she left her apartment. The air was heavy, like an approaching storm. Guards were posted at every corner, no longer trying to be discreet. They stood in pairs, their eyes scanning everything. She knew they had guns hidden under their jackets. She quickly realized the number of guards had doubled. Something was terribly wrong. Nikolai's office door was open a little. Connor was inside, his face more serious than she had ever seen. He was speaking quietly to Nikolai. Maddie heard a few words before they saw her. Caruso is moving tonight, Connor said, his voice tense. Nikolai said something she could not hear. Connor shook his head. He's crazy. Attacking the main house is suicide. Maddie froze outside the door, her heart hammering. Caruso was attacking tonight. The words spun in her head. She thought of Isla and Miss Walsh. She thought of this place that had become a home. She felt true fear, not for herself, but for everything she now had to lose. Nikolai looked up and met her gaze. His face was grim. He signaled to Connor, who nodded and left the room, giving Maddie a worried glance. Come inside, Nikolai said, his voice strained. Maddie entered, closing the door. What is happening? She demanded. There are guards everywhere. All meetings were canceled today. Connor looks terrified. Tell me what is going on. Nikolai watched her for a moment, his gray eyes steady. He was deciding what to reveal. It is a business matter, he finally said. Nothing for you to worry about. A surge of anger rose in Maddie. Do not lie to me, she said sharply. I heard them say Caruso. I heard them say attack. Do not treat me like I am a child. Nikolai's jaw clenched. His expression was not anger, but worry. Caruso is making a move, he said, his voice low. We believe it will be tonight. We are preparing for anything. Maddie swallowed. She knew that meant an attack on this very estate. His silence confirmed it. I promise to protect you and Isla, he said, his eyes like steel. I will keep that promise. Maddie tried to trust him, but a storm was coming. Tuesday afternoon was filled with a tense quiet. She sat in Nikolai's office, pretending to review a contract. He stood by the window, speaking Russian on the phone, his voice strained. Maddie kept glancing at the glass, waiting for something terrible to happen, and then it did. The door flew open. Connor burst in with his gun drawn. Boss, Caruso's men are here. He never finished the sentence. The window behind Nikolai exploded. The sound of shattering glass was absolute. Wind screamed through the opening, followed instantly by gunfire. Razor-sharp fragments rained down across the room. Maddie sat frozen, watching her world come apart. But Nikolai reacted in a flash. Before she could process the chaos, he lunged over the desk. He slammed into her, dragging her to the floor. His body became her shield. Bullets tore through the office, destroying everything. Maddie wanted to scream, but her throat was locked. She trembled beneath Nikolai as he calmly took out his phone. Walsh, he said, his voice like ice. Secure the baby right now. He ended the call and looked down at her, his stare sharp and intense. Are you hurt? She shook her head, unable to speak. She saw only small cuts from the glass. Good. He glanced over at Connor, who was already returning fire through the broken window. Nikolai's voice was calm and steady. Connor, perimeter. 3 vehicles. They are trying to get inside. He then turned his full attention to Maddie. Listen to me very carefully, he said, his voice absolute. He held her face, forcing her to look at him. You will crawl to that door. You will run to the apartment. You will lock yourself and Isla in the safe room. The code is 0815. Do you remember? Maddie nodded, her throat tight. 0815. Say it, he demanded. 0815. Good. Nikolai released her. Now go. She could not move. What about you? She whispered. I will handle this. Go to Isla. Protect her. A loud blast shook the building, and he pushed her toward the door. As she crawled away, his voice cut through the gunfire, cold and lethal. You just made the last mistake of your life. The gunfire grew louder, but Maddie kept moving. She ran down a corridor that felt endless. Blood dripped from her hands and knees onto the floor, but she felt nothing except a crushing fear for her daughter. The explosions and screams sounded like a war. She rounded a corner and saw her apartment door ajar. Her heart stopped. She threw herself inside. Miss Walsh was there, holding Isla in one arm and a gun in the other. She moved quickly toward a back room. Get inside now, the agent ordered. Maddie followed her into a small room with steel walls. It was the safe room. Miss Walsh entered the code 0815. The heavy door shut with a final thud, sealing them inside. The chaos outside was muffled, but the fear was not. Isla started crying, sensing the danger in the air. Miss Walsh passed the baby to her mother. Maddie held her daughter tightly, rocking her. It is okay. Mommy is here, she whispered. But the words felt like a lie. How could she protect her child from this? Miss Walsh stood by the door, weapon ready. Her calm presence helped, but the fear was still suffocating. Every minute was torture. Every gunshot felt like a blade twisting in her heart. She could only think of Nikolai, out there in that storm of bullets. He could be hurt, or worse. All she could do was wait. Please, she prayed. Let him be okay. Exhausted from crying, Isla finally fell asleep in her arms. Maddie envied her daughter's innocence. She wished she could close her eyes and believe everything would be fine. But she could not move. She just sat in the cold room, holding her sleeping child. She prayed for the man she now knew she loved. 20 minutes passed like an eternity. She did not know how long she had been in that steel room, listening to the gunfire finally fade away. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The sounds of battle meant Nikolai was still fighting. Silence could mean anything. It could mean he had won. It could mean he was dead. Maddie held Isla tighter. Miss Walsh stood by the door, her weapon aimed and ready. No one moved. Then they heard footsteps outside, heavy and slow. Maddie held her breath. The baby stirred in her arms. Miss Walsh prepared to shoot whoever walked through that door. A beep from the keypad sent a shock of fear through Maddie. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Only 3 people knew that code. Nikolai, Connor, and Miss Walsh. An enemy should not have it. But what if they had tortured someone for the numbers? The door swung open and relief flooded through her, so strong she almost buckled. Nikolai stood there. He was alive, but looked as if he had clawed his way back from hell itself. Blood covered him. His suit was torn to rags. A deep gash on his cheek was still weeping blood. Yet his gray eyes were bright and sharp. Miss Walsh lowered her firearm, gave a single nod, and then slipped out of the room, leaving them alone. Maddie got to her feet, her legs unsteady, still holding Isla tightly. Words failed her. Before she could even think what to ask, Nikolai closed the distance in 2 strides and pulled both of them into his arms. She smelled gunpowder and blood. She felt the frantic, wild beating of his heart against her own. And then she felt something impossible. He was shaking. Nikolai Vulov, the wolf of New York, trembled as he held them. "I am sorry," he rasped into her hair, his voice broken. "This world is mine. I put you in its path." Maddie pulled back just enough to see his face. "You protected us. You kept your word." But his eyes were haunted. "What if I had been too late?" "But you were not," Maddie insisted. She lifted a hand, her fingers gently tracing the bleeding cut on his cheek. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. He simply held them there in the cold steel room. Awakened by their voices, Isla stirred. The baby saw Nikolai and, without crying, reached a tiny hand to touch his wound. A soft hiss of pain escaped him, but he stayed perfectly still, staring down at the child with an expression of pure awe. "Caruso?" Maddie asked, her voice quiet. Nikolai's eyes turned to stone. "He is handled." Maddie did not ask for more. She did not need to. The threat was gone. They were safe. Nikolai was here, holding them as if they were his entire world. "That cut needs to be cleaned," she said, her voice more steady than she felt. "Later." He answered, "All I need right now is to know you are both okay." He just kept holding them in the silence that followed the fight. Isla continued to stare at Nikolai, her little hand resting near the cut. Her brow furrowed in concern, a look Maddie had seen 100 times. But this time was different. This time, there were no tears. Instead, Isla opened her mouth and spoke a single, clear word. "Oe." Maddie's breath hitched. Her heart seemed to stop, then began to pound furiously. She stared at her daughter, unable to believe what she heard. Isla looked right at Nikolai, her face a mask of worry, and said it again to be sure he understood. "Oe." Then she gently patted his injured cheek. For 11 months, Maddie had tried to teach her words. Not mama, not dada. Her daughter's very first word was for Nikolai's pain. Maddie looked up at him and saw his mask had shattered. There was no Mafia boss, only a man with tears in his eyes and a trembling lip. He pulled Isla into a fierce, desperate hug. Isla did not fight the embrace. She melted into him. Her small hand continued to pat his face while she repeated the word, "Owie, owie." Nikolai's voice cracked. "It is fine, little one. I am fine." But he was crying. Maddie watched tears slide down his cheeks, mixing with the drying blood. The man feared by all of New York was weeping because an 11-month-old child was worried for him. After a long moment, he looked at Maddie, his gray eyes pleading. "Stay," he said, his voice raw with years of buried pain. "Both of you, please stay with me. Let me protect you. Let me care for you," he begged, swallowing hard. "Let me be something other than this monster." Tears were now streaming down Maddie's own face. She looked at this man, covered in the evidence of the violence he had committed to save them. He was begging for a chance at humanity. She reached out and took his bloody hand in hers. "You already are," she whispered, her voice shaking, but certain. "Isla saw it from the very first day, and now I see it too." She placed her other hand over his heart. "You are not a monster, Nikolai. You are a man who has done terrible things to survive. You are the man who saved my daughter. You are the man that Isla loves." Maddie looked up, a small smile appearing through her tears. "So yes, we will stay. Not because you asked. We will stay because we want to." He stared at her as if she had just given him the sun. He could not find any words. Instead, he simply pulled her closer, wrapping them both in an embrace she never wanted to leave. From between them, a bright, happy voice suddenly announced, "All better?" Nikolai and Maddie went still, then burst into laughter. The sound echoed in the steel room, warm and full of hope. Delighted, Isla clapped her hands and said it again. All better. And somehow, it was. 6 months later, the world had changed. Golden light poured over the gardens of the estate. It was a place Maddie once only saw from a distance as a member of the cleaning staff. Now she stood among the roses, listening to her daughter's laughter. The 17-month-old girl was toddling quickly across the lawn. "She is running," Maddie called out, laughing. Isla glanced back, grinned, and kept going, her blonde pigtails bouncing with each step. Then, the little girl ran directly into a pair of legs waiting for her. Nikolai bent down and swung her high into the air. Isla shrieked with pure, unrestrained joy. Maddie watched them, her heart so full it felt like it might break. This was not the man she had met nearly a year ago. He wore jeans and a white shirt, his expensive suits left hanging in the closet. The wind was in his hair, and a real smile was on his face. The scar on his cheek had faded to a faint line. It was a reminder of his past, but it no longer defined him. Maddie walked over as Nikolai held Isla with a tenderness few would believe possible. "You spoil her," she said, her voice filled only with love. His gray eyes were warm, a look she and Isla were the only ones to see. "That is my job," he replied. He held Isla with one arm and used the other to pull Maddie closer. "And spoiling both of you is my job." He leaned down and gave her a soft kiss. It was filled with all the emotion he had spent 20 years trying to find. Maddie closed her eyes and sank into the feeling of being loved and safe. Between them, Isla clapped her hands. More kisses, more kisses. Nikolai and Maddie laughed. He kissed Maddie's forehead, then Isla's cheek. The little girl giggled with joy. "Is that enough, little princess?" he asked. Isla shook her head, still clapping. More, more. And Nikolai, the crime boss who once made New York tremble, did exactly what his daughter asked. 17-month-old child. Maddie watched the two people she loved most in the world. She thought about how they arrived here. Only a year ago, Maddie was a single mother with nothing. She was completely without hope. Nikolai was a monster to the world. A man living with 2 decades of pain. They were two people who should have never met or fallen in love. But a baby changed their destiny. Little Isla, who trusted no one but her mother, put her arms around a feared man. She saw his true heart, and with that simple act of trust, she saved him. She saved Maddie, too. The bonds you least expect are often the ones that heal you. Hope can appear in the most surprising places. Love does not need an explanation. It is pure and powerful, like a child's immediate trust. This story shows that we must look beyond the surface. A cold outside can hide a heart that needs love. A mother's strength and a child's innocence can break down any wall. We often judge people by how they look or what we hear. We forget everyone has a story and carries their own pain. And so, our story comes to a close. What did the journeys of Maddie, Nikolai, and little Isla make you feel? Did it connect to something in your own life? We would love to read your feelings in the comments below. If this story meant something to you, please like this video and share it with someone you love. Subscribe to our channel to get more moving stories every day. We truly appreciate you staying with us until the end. We wish you and your family health and lasting peace. Goodbye, and we will see you again very soon. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and inspiration to our audience.